this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. You know, I run my mouth a lot about science and about being a scientist and how I rely on those methods that have been developed over the years through study and practice. And I'll stick with that. I'm not going to deviate from that at all. But, you know, there's this one theme that runs through medical legal death investigation. And it's the idea of documenting everything that we see. I tell my students at Jacksonville State University, without fail, every year, I teach a medical legal death investigation class for undergraduates twice a year. And I tell them, I say, look, you are in fact going to be the documentarian of things that are happening in the world in which you find yourself in, the world of death. But it's important to understand that you're also a historian, because you're documenting the lives of individuals that otherwise may not have even been a blip on the radar screen of life. Today is one such case, a case that reaches back all the way to 1967 in Great Britain. It's about a little old lady that was found dead on her living room floor, or as the Brits like to say, the room of her parlor. And she had undergone brutality that is almost unimaginable. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, I always have an affinity for British names, and town names in particular, things like Gloucester. And these different types of names of cities that, you know, we have them here in America, but, you know, because of the way we form our words and these sorts of things, they don't necessarily come off the same when you go back to the mother tongue, if you will, when you're over in Great Britain.
Mother tongue.
Yeah, I know. And so you see like one town that's going to factor prevalently into our story today is a town called Ipswich. And there's actually an Ipswich here in America. There might be a couple. There probably are in the Northeast. Yeah. And it's one of those odd words or odd names that actually sounds the same here as it does there. But
that's how you can tell that leaders of a particular county got together and said, we got a bunch of people that want to form their own town. We got to give it a name. And they start throwing it. By the time last call rolls around, it's like, Ipswich. That's Ipswich. Yeah.
Do you need a handkerchief?
Can you write it down? All right. Good job, Dave.
Yeah, the Ipswich Rapist actually comes into play here, Dave. And that's, you know, all of these cases like this, particularly years ago, the press used to like to give them names. And I think a lot of that slinging the ink, if you will, it's very salacious. I'll give you an example. You know, we had in Atlanta a series of homicides involving elderly ladies that was called the Vine City Killer. Right. And it's got that ring to it, you know, and in this particular case or cases, we have the Ipswich Rapist. You know, right now they're talking about, and the press loves these. We've got Lisk, the Long Island serial killer, and now we have Nisk, the New England serial killer. They just love this stuff. I don't know if it's an economy of word or if it's something that they're just trying to dangle in front of the public to get you coming back for more.
Actually, it is that. It's a way to keep people, because if you can identify, you know, a story by an individual or by a location, then people recognize what it is, and you don't have to explain it every time. So yeah, it's word economy and marketing, you know, is much better. But in this one, you're talking about a murder that took place of a 75-year-old tiny woman, and it happened when I was a baby, and her town and community and what family was left. I mean, they're all dead and gone except for one detective and one family member. All these years later, you're going to tell me that in 1967, this crime took place. There was evidence left behind, including a fingerprint, a palm print, and DNA, and did not get it solved until right now. This is a story that is ongoing as we speak. It has just been to that point where we now know who the suspect is and how long said suspect will be spending in prison. But Joe, why? Why is it possible that in 1967 you had a fingerprint, a palm print, and you had other evidence and no suspect can get wrangled? I don't get that. How does something like that happen?
Well, if somebody, I always say this, Dave. You know, I have people, and look, I don't think that they're uneducated. I think they're ill-educated about certain things. They believe that if you have some type of scientific marker at a scene, whether it be a fingerprint, a droplet of blood, seminal deposition, or even a tool mark, they'll say, well, you've got this bit of data. Once you go compare it to something and make an arrest. Okay, what am I going to compare it to? Because if no one is in the database, say, for instance, for fingerprints, it's grand. I'm so happy for you that you recovered a partial palm print, or, maybe a partial off of a thumb or an index finger. And you did a great job at the scene. Look at this. Look at all of the detail we can see. We can classify this, and we can identify this minutia and all this stuff.
Right.
But if you don't have anything to compare it to, and the same principle applies with DNA, you can go and collect DNA, but if somebody, for instance, is not in the CODIS database in America, then you got a great profile and it'll be great for future reference. But if you've got nobody to compare it to, it's, as Grandpappy used to say, it ain't worth the gunpowder to blow it to hell. It has no value at that particular point in time. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to have value in the future. Understand me there. And that's the beauty of this. Historically, I talked about documenting everything that we see and everything that we do. If it had not been for the work of those individuals that have, I don't know, by this time, long since turned to dust, if you will.
Right.
If they had not documented it back then, we would not have an arrest affected as of, I think it was July the 1st, Dave, when you had somebody that was hooked up on charges on this thing.
The woman's name is Louisa Dunne, 75-year-old small woman. That was the physical description by a neighbor. Yeah. She's so tiny and so fragile, and 75 years old in 1967. That means that she was born in the 1890s.
Yeah, when Great Britain was still an empire.
Right.
It still ruled India, these sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. She had lived through 2 world wars. She had lived through the first man going into space.
Yeah.
And I think about this now. Her murder was solved by technology that today we sometimes take for granted. I am just as bad as everybody else about watching SVU on TV. Yeah. And just assuming that once you've got DNA, boom, you got everything. It's done. Don't even, do not go to commercial break. We got to get another story lined up. We already got this one. But like you said, to start with, if it's not in the system, if there's not something there, you're talking about going down a different pathway. And now we do have genetic genealogy and other things, which some of us are against, some of us are not. How you feel about government intrusion on your private life. And there are plenty of issues to discuss on a different day and time. But the bottom line is the detectives in 1967 did a good job at collecting, because what they were able to collect that day. Now, what did they find, Joe, at the scene of Louisa Dunne's home when she was found, because I know that it was a neighbor that actually they hadn't seen her that morning. Right. And she had a regular routine where they knew they would see her every morning. And when they didn't, I'm talking about neighbors right. didn't see her. And so again, now this is at a time when I don't really recall 1967. I don't know how people normally lived their lives then, but I think they were, their heads were not always tilted down looking at a 5.5-inch screen in their palm of their hand.
Oh, Lord, no. I mean, you had, what was that show that Tim Allen had years ago where
Home Improvement. Talking
where
over the fence.
Talk to the guy over the fence. Mm-hmm. You had a lot of fence talking that would go on.
Actually had a radio show called Across the Fence every morning at 9 a.m.
And it's something that's missing. Mm-hmm. I know that my grandmother, she had a hedgerow at her house in the front yard. The back of the house was a farm. But she had a neighbor that lived next door, and they would literally talk over the hedge to one another. Wow. And it could be shouting back and forth while they're feeding their dogs that they kept outside and that sort of thing. But you get into a routine, during that period of time. And those people had a routine. I mean, it's no different than a life that's lived now. It's that when somebody turns up, and if somebody is kind of reclusive anyway, maybe you're the one person that actually ever sees them. And when they don't make an appearance, it actually raises the eyebrow a bit. But and we have to keep in mind, I've done a disservice here because we have to understand that where Louisa's homicide took place was actually on the western side, actually the southwestern side of Great Britain. And that comes into play here as far as I'm concerned. It's in the town of Bristol. Okay.
Is it because it was a port town? Is that why it comes into play?
Well, yeah, it does, because we're going to get to Ipswich in a bit. But with Bristol, it's on the southwestern side of the country, and it is a port town. Interestingly enough, I was last September when I was in Great Britain, I got to visit a university, Dave, where they're doing excavations of a graveyard of industrial workers in Bristol that they discovered. And some of these people are stacked on top of one another, and they've got all of the skeletons that they are pulling out of these graves there have these unique findings relative to the industrial age of Great Britain. Wow. This is when industry was just getting cooking. You've got these like huge wear patterns on the bones of traumatic arthritis and all these other things, fractures that never got repaired. You find evidence of malnourishment, in the bones. And I got to see some of these skeletons, but those all came out of Bristol. That was a fascinating visit, by the way.
Kind of gives you a different idea of what rest in peace really means.
It really does. Particularly, we do so much arresting nowadays that, we can't really comprehend the world that, that our forebears lived in. Yeah. When you've got actual evidence of tuberculoid changes in bone, for instance.
What does that mean?
And that really,
I don't know
they had tuberculosis at some point in time, and you can actually see that manifested on the bone.
What?
And yeah. And it's all of these little things. And we're going to do an entire episode very shortly, my friends, on forensic anthropology. And I'm going to introduce a term in there that applies to this. But so Bristol, seaport, industrial town, she was found, in her home. The neighbor actually, if I'm not mistaken, Dave, I think they came in through the window.
Yeah, it was the neighbor, and you've taught me to look at the finder. I actually titled it The Finder, I think, because I was wondering, you've got an unsolved crime. Who was the finder? Yeah. And actually, she didn't see her that morning. And so after a while, I was like, go check on her. And so she walked over to the house and peeked in the window and saw her, Louisa. She said that she thought maybe it was a heart attack because Louisa was 75 years old. And so she went to a side window that she was able to get open, and she crawled through the window. And of course, when she got upon the body, she wasn't totally sure. She just knew she was dead. She grabbed her hand, and she actually described it, as her hand was cold as ice.
Yeah, and that's one thing that never really leaves you. There is cold, and we've all experienced it. But when the icy fingers of death grip you, it's something that you will never, ever forget. Dave, you had mentioned the neighbor. The neighbor's name is actually Vi Allen. And when Vi came into Miss Dunne's home and discovered that she had this coolness to the touch, if you will, you automatically, it's a weird thing that we have. I don't know if it's a primal thing or whatever it is with us humans. It almost makes you, it does in certain instances, it will make you retract. Did you know that? Mm. It'll actually make you, it's startling, when you touch a body and it's icy cold like that, because
if you don't
it's
expect
not something that's expected.
I remember I asked you about this one time when I was sitting up with the dead at a funeral home.
Yeah.
And they asked me, because they'd had too many people, more people than expected, came by for an evening visitation, and the hair needed to be fixed because the family was coming in early for some private time with the body. And I had never been alone with a deceased person that I knew.
Yeah.
And I knew his daughter. And so as I'm in there, I didn't, hey man, comb the hair, not a big deal, until you have to go comb the hair by yourself in a funeral home at night when you're the only one there and you're a child.
And you've never done it before.
And you're a teenager. And so I ended up looking, and I saw his chest rising. Yeah. Rising. He's wearing a pinstripe suit.
Right.
I know it's an optical illusion because we don't ever actually see anybody breathe. We see it constantly. So our mind is conditioned to see that chest rise and fall, even though we never pay attention to it. Now, this was what was being explained to me on the phone, which, by the way, this is before cordless phones. Thankfully, they had a phone that had a really long cord.
That reached around the corner?
I was outside. I was outside with the door open, and I'm standing there in the yard with the little springy thing as far as it would go. And Steve Bryan Lee Funeral Home is Dave. Believe me, I did it myself. The man is not alive. Steve, he's breathing. You have to be here now because I'm leaving. Dave, don't leave. You cannot leave. Yeah.
I got to tell you, that plays right into something. I guess this morbid note has always been present in my life, because even as a kid, I remember asking my mother at one point, Tom, when people would die on television, like I used to love things like Gunsmoke. I love to watch Gunsmoke and shows like High Chaparral and, those old Wild Wild West, all of those old Western series. And I remember asking my mother if they were dead, and she'd say, no, they're acting. And I have a distinct memory as I got older, I would always look at the chest of the actors laid on the ground. And I was fascinated by how long they could hold their breath, because if it was like a shot where they would hold on the body, their chest would not rise and fall. I did see, however, a couple of times where you could see it. And so, that was an editing problem.
Yeah. But you want to freak yourself out? I've got one for you. Go watch Deliverance. Okay. Yeah. Right after the rape scene, after Ned Beatty gets boogered. Yeah. Look at the guy that's dead. Okay. Yeah. His name's Bill McKinney, I think.
Yeah. Bill McKinney. Yeah.
For 2 minutes, Bill McKinney laid motionless, did not breathe, kept his eyes open. A mosquito landed on the white of his eye, and the man didn't blink. They didn't have to cut. 2 minutes. Just, if you have a chance to watch that movie, and most men do not watch that part of the movie. No, they don't. If not, we usually leave crying, screaming, and throwing up. But it's disturbing. It's the reason a lot of us don't ever want to end up in prison. It's the reason you keep. And so, anyway,
it's the reason some of us don't want to take canoe trips either.
Oh, buddy,
but so you come into a home with an individual that is deceased, and your frame of reference for them is life. And so the first thing that you notice when you place your hand on them is this iciness that they have about them. But there were other things that were not right. She could tell pretty quickly that Miss Dunne had endured some level of trauma. And when she rang up the local constabulary, as they're called over there, they arrived at the scene. And what they saw, Dave, I'm not saying that, in Bristol they had not had rape homicides before. That's ridiculous. Of course they have. It's a big town. They would have seen it. But this is something that really captured the town, the imagination, the press, and everything, because it's not like this is a couple, as they say in Great Britain, a couple of blokes that were having at it in the local pub. Right. They were pummeling each other. You're talking about this diminutive little old lady who's a recluse that's found in her home, and she's wearing her dress, but it's all disheveled, and it appears that a scarf has actually been used around her neck to choke the life out of her, Dave.
When I was reading over the description of Louisa Dunne, again, a 75-year-old, very small woman, and the description that she's lying flat on her back in her living room, cuts around her chin, bruising to her neck and inner thigh, and hemorrhaging in her eyes. What does the cuts, the hemorrhaging, what does that tell you right off the bat? Laying flat on her back seemed odd to me. I don't know why it did. I would have thought she would have been in a different position, but laying flat on her back
Right. Well, first off, the level of violence is, first off, you're not going to have to use a tremendous amount of force with her. Right. And you couple that with the fact that the older you get, the more fragile you get. A lot of us can reflect now, like our grandparents. Did you ever notice how easily your grandparents bruised and how long they would hold on to a bruise, on their arms, and their skin becomes almost like parchment paper. I remember that about my grandmother. I remember it in a loving way, but, you can see that the fragility of life, and so it doesn't take a lot to inflict injuries to the elderly. However, in this particular case, there are certain injuries that really stand out. You've got cuts, you've got bruises, but one of the interesting manifestations here are these injuries on the interior of the thighs. Most of the time, you're going to have these there is a difference between raped and forcible rape. Some people will be raped and they'll just acquiesce and give in. And it's horrible to think about. They realize but some people do really fight back. You couple that with somebody that's incredibly savage. Even if the person is bending to the will of the perpetrator, they'll still want to be violent with them. And so you'll see, like on the inner thighs, I've actually seen contusions, Dave, on the inner thighs of women that have been raped, where you can actually match up finger patterns, not fingerprints, but right. You will see the outline of a hand where a hand has been placed on the inner thigh and the legs forced open. And then, things begin to get into focus at that point in time about what actually probably happened in this environment. The assailant is pressing himself upon her. She probably reacts, with some level of violence on her own to try to fend this guy off. And that's not happening. What's he going to do? Well, I don't know if male perpetrators carry around lady scarves in their pockets. I guess they could if there's they have some kind of serialized fetish with this. But it would seem to me that you're using what I like to refer to as a weapon of convenience. If she's got a scarf laying around the house, this is something that he can actually wrap around her throat and use as a ligature. And the thing, when you get a scarf, and if everybody will just imagine in your mind I'm not talking about like what do you call it? Like a knit scarf like you wear in the winter time. Okay. Toboggan, not a toboggan. Right. That's a hat, but a woolen scarf. I'm talking about like a decorative scarf. They're very delicate most of the time. But as you take them and you kind of twist them around, they become more robust, and they truly do become a thicker ligature. But they're not going to leave the same marks behind that, say, for instance, a rope or a wire is going to leave behind. But what it will leave behind are these delicate little contusions underneath the skin. And scarves themselves seem very very soft and pliable. Some of them are nylon, many of them are silk. But did you know, even with silk, it has an abrasive quality to it. And you can see light little surface abrasions on the skin. And underlying those abrasions, you're actually going to see contusions in the muscles around the neck. And this can be kind of verified, I think, by virtue of the fact that they talk about that she had this kind of storm of hemorrhage in her eyes, which are, of course, what they're saying in these reports is that what they're describing are actually petechia. And these particular hemorrhages, and I've had doctors that have referred to them as petechial storms, and it's because there's so many of them that they're almost innumerable.
Wow!
Because they're so tiny, and they like to refer to them as punctate, almost like a little dot. And you can't. It's hard to describe if you've never seen them, but when you look at the white of the eye, the sclera, you'll see them there, and also on the inner lid of the eye as well. It's almost like they're matching up. So the little vessels in the lower lid of the eye, and sometimes the upper lid, and then all over the white of the eye, the more pressure that's applied, the more these vessels will give way. And it's also an indication of life in a perimortem state where they're fighting against this so robustly that the eyes just become so congested with these things. It would have been a very violent death for Louisa, but in its wake, that perpetrator that committed this awful crime left behind physical evidence back in 1967 that has damned him in 2025. So, Dave, in 1967, Louisa Dunne is a homicide victim in Bristol, Great Britain, and the case is not solved. It goes cold, kind of like her body was cold, per the description of the finder on that morning. We jump all the way forward. I think it's 1973. Now we're going from one major port city in Great Britain, which is on the West Coast in Bristol, all the way to Ipswich, which is on the East Coast, which almost, I'm going to be off of my alignment here, which almost lines up. It's actually a bit north.
Okay.
Let me get this straight. So it's northeast of London, if you will. It's not in northeastern England. That's way up north, like York and that area. But Ipswich lines up closer to like being just south of like Amsterdam, if you were to lay a straight line across it. It's north of Dunkirk, which of course is in Belgium or France. I can't remember, right on the border there. And of course, it's north of what we know is the White Cliffs of Dover, where our boys would be coming back in. They knew that as they saw the White Cliffs of Dover, they had made it safely back from a bombing run. So it's north of that area, but yet it is a major port city. And I find this very interesting, Dave, that we've got this homicide that took place back in 1967 and that's unsolved in one port city. And then we've got what turns out to be a couple of rapes in a town that is on the east coast of England. And again, a port city, Dave.
10 years later, 1977, two older women.
77. I was thinking 73, but yeah, 77.
But the thing is that when you go back to the 67 rape, murder, and you mentioned the injuries and the fight in her. Yeah. Because 10 years later, when two older women, one 69, the other 74, I think, in Ipswich, when the Ipswich Rapist was labeled, that's what they called him. Yep. 79 and 84. That's how old the women were that were raped in Ipswich. And just so you know, in 1967, they did fingerprinting and got a fingerprint and a palm print out of the house of the suspect. They then fingerprinted everybody in the area they fingerprinted, I think, over 5,000 local men in Bristol. Think about that. The time it took to fingerprint, analyze, and look, and trying to match up. So it was an ongoing project that involved multiple agencies. By 1970, there was one person working on it. They'd exhausted everything they could do to try to match up the fingerprint or palm print. Now, 10 years after the murder of Louisa Dunne, you have a 79 and an 84-year-old woman who are now in Ipswich, and they are both raped. So they do find fingerprints at the scene. And the investigators, they start doing the exact same thing they did 10 years earlier in Bristol. They start carding everybody. They start charting fingerprints on every male they could find that had any kind of access to that area at the time of those two rapes that were done by the press labeled the Ipswich Rapist, Joe.
You know, I got to tell you, this is an interesting thing, comparative analysis between gathering of suspect data when you compare it to the U.S. and Great Britain. I'm going to throw a name out to you that sounds rather odd, a guy named Colin Pitchfork. And Colin Pitchfork was responsible for the rape and murder of two young girls in Great Britain. Well, Colin Pitchfork is the first case where DNA was actually used to convict somebody.
Oh, wow. First ever?
Yeah. Oh. As a matter of fact, it came off of the research that Sir Alec Jeffreys was doing. Alec Jeffreys is considered to be the father of modern DNA, forensic DNA technology. Okay. And brilliant mind. But when Colin Pitchfork, and I think this was in 86, committed, these crimes, I think it was, like in 1979 through 83 or something like that. I can't remember the exact dates. The area where he took these lives and committed these crimes, Dave, they got a block of males in this area and compelled them to give DNA samples. Can you imagine them doing that in America? And you begin to think about doing the fingerprints on compelling somebody to give up their fingerprints. It's just a different way of policing. It's a different way that they handle things. So this kind of harkened back, I'm thinking about this, and it's interesting to think about, how our two systems work. And I know a lot of people would say, well, if you got nothing to hide, then you shouldn't fear anything. But,
just so you know, that's the same thing. Dave, why won't you let them in the house to look for because they don't have a right. That's why. But Dave, if you've got nothing to hide, I don't have anything to hide, but they have no right to look. Think about it. A Mark Furman exists to drop a bloody glove in your hallway. That's all I'm saying.
So you've got that specter that's out there, but either way, with the Ipswich Rapist and how it applies to Louisa Dunne, is that they actually developed evidence, Dave, based upon this partial palm print and fingerprint, where they're able to tie what they think eventually would be these cases together, Dave.
Well, I know that they were able to find Ryland Headley is the guy's name. And Ryland Headley was 45 years old when the rapes in Ipswich happened in 77. And he was one of the many who actually was fingerprinted, and he was matched up, and actually it went all the way through. He was guilty of the crimes of burglary and rape, and was sentenced. Now, here's the important part to pay attention to on what happened to Ryland Headley when he was arrested, charged, convicted in the rapes of those two women in Ipswich in 1977. Now, he was sentenced to life in prison. These crimes were considered so heinous that this person did not need to be walking the face of the earth. Remember, these are elderly women, 79 and 84 years old. They could not. One of the women actually tried to bite him. But you know why she couldn't? She didn't have her dentures in. She couldn't leave a mark. That's how hard she was struggling. And that impacted the judge at sentencing when he heard this description, because these women did not die, but they fought. And so Headley was sentenced to life. Well, his attorneys, or barristers, as they're called there.
Right.
Whenever I get a letter from a barrister that claims they've got some money for me overseas, yeah, get those emails about once a month. Just send $100. Yeah. Anyway, so the barrister said, hey, these are rapes. This sentence is excessive. And so there was an appeal of the sentence of Ryland Headley. And the appeal court actually lent heavily. And I say this because it's really important to note that there was a psychiatrist who came in and said he has no record of anything before this. He was a good guy of good character. We've got nothing on him. Now, granted, they only know what he's been convicted of. Right. Which are these two
married
rapes.
With kids as well.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Married with children. Forgot about that. And so you've got a guy of good reputation, and they argued in that, and the judge sided with the psychiatrist that this was a momentary lapse in judgment and whatever you want to call it, and reduced his sentence to 7 years. So the Ipswich Rapist of 1977, Ryland Headley, walked out of prison in 1980. Think about that for just a minute, Joseph Scott Morgan.
Yeah, and that they would cut this guy loose. I guess hindsight is in fact 2020.
They blamed his wife. They blamed his wife. They said that she was not providing the sex that he needed, and he was committing the burglaries to satisfy her need for stuff. So it was his wife's fault. That's why he stole, burglarized, and raped these old women.
So she needed stuff and he needed sex.
Yes.
So he would prey upon the elderly.
Right.
And that's essentially excusable, I guess.
Yes.
Well, it would seem, yeah, no kidding. Well, because of that, though, because of what had occurred, the story gets even more interesting. As we've developed through time in crime science, Dave, databases, national databases have been created relative to any kind of biological sample that might come up. In the U.S., we have CODIS. So CODIS is, you have two categories. You have the known offenders, like if somebody gets hooked up, they're in jail, they're hooked up on a rape charge or some kind of sexual offense. You're compelled by law to give a DNA sample, and that goes into the database. The other category is called the forensic database, which is a list of unknowns. Well, the perpetrator in this case, is compelled, his DNA from the 77 cases was actually placed into the database. That wound up with a match on his DNA that I think that they took from him in 2012. They went back and got this from him. Is that correct? Okay.
He got tangled up with law enforcement in 2012. Now, we cannot be told what happened, because whatever he was arrested for in 2012, whatever the charge was, whatever was going on, it was all dropped. And because they worry about a person's appearance, I guess. Yeah. So since there was no adjudication of the case, it was just dropped. We can't even find out what he was arrested for, but it was involved enough that they did arrest him. They did the whole fingerprint thing all over again, updated their records, and got DNA.
Yeah. And
so that was where
it was because of that they were able to actually go back. And if I remember correctly, all the way back with the Bristol homicide with Louisa Dunne, they had done a rape kit on her back then, obviously, because there's this obvious signs of sexual assault. Dave, in that case, they lost the rape kit. They lost it. They lost the samples that were taken. But for over 50 years, they kept her clothing folded up inside of a box away from daylight and kept it stowed. Now, just imagine this. I don't see how they were able to retain the clothing, but didn't retain the rape kit for whatever reason. I don't know. It probably didn't go to the same place. Probably went to a hospital.
We lose stuff all the time here. You know,
we do.
It's numbing to me, the number of important cases that we have all this information that didn't even happen a long time ago, but get lost because we don't have the money to store things properly. But anyway.
And we'll spend money on other things, but you know, we don't have, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's an absence of common sense and an absence of compassion. These poor women have been assaulted, and you can't do your due diligence to hold on to a rape kit and secure it. I don't know. It's a real head scratcher. It always has been for me. It
is for me too. And I didn't realize it was a problem until I started doing these shows in the last 5 years. I didn't know.
Horrible. Absolutely horrible. Anyway,
there were two interesting times of this too, Joe. 2 times, 2009 and 2014. The case of Louisa's case was brought back out. They didn't just say in 1970, we've exhausted everything we can do. They didn't do that. It was a cold case, but they would revisit it. And then in 2009, they actually brought the case back to the fore and looked at it. Didn't find anything. That's kind of surprising. But it was in 2014, 2 years after the 2012 investigation, that they brought it out again. But that's where you've got no rape kit. You don't have the things you need. So it's looked at multiple occasions. But it wasn't until the last 12 months that they were able to go to those clothing. And it was the clothing that provided
the dress.
And that's what I got to ask you. I even wrote it down here because I don't understand what it means, Joe. What did they actually do? How did they get the material out of the clothing that they could then test?
I'm not going to mention any names, but the initials are Bill Clinton. If you'll think back to the infamous blue dress,
right,
that Lewinsky retained, it's the same principle. Okay. They had seminal deposition on Louisa Dunne's clothing. Okay. And the way this happens is that most of the time nowadays with clothing, you might not be able to see anything with the naked eye, or as some people refer to it, the unaided eye. What you'll do is use alternative lighting sources, which, you know, you'll be able to see, because light works on wavelengths, right? And so you can use ultraviolet light, for instance, where the seminal stain will give off a very particular type of luminescence when it's certain when certain lighting is applied to it. Now that is merely a qualitative test. You can't say whose semen that is, or and if it contains spermatozoa. All you can say is that this is consistent with seminal deposition. So then you have to go in and sample those areas, and they go into a further test on that particular bit of clothing after they've identified it with what's called an acid phosphatase test. And when men ejaculate, contained within the ejaculate, there is a certain high amount of an enzyme, acid phosphatase, contained in there. And when you can identify that, then you know that you can go deeper with your examination relative to the specifics about the identity of the individual. And it's through that stain that they were able to claim a biological profile after all of these years, Dave.
Unbelievable.
I know it is. It's mind-blowing. And of course, because this subject had been compelled to be entered into the database
in 2012,
they got a hit once they brought this thing out. Now, I think that they probably suspected him because one of the things that's going to kind of shore this thing up is this partial palm print. Yeah. And these are other compelling bits of evidence. Remember, you no longer have any eyewitnesses or secondary eyewitnesses. You don't have any any of the people that were going to appear in court back in the late 60s.
There's only one detective left, Joe.
One detective. And I think that maybe her granddaughter is still alive. But she's a human being, and her case is still open. And this guy's been living his life all of these years. Dave has been able to have a family. Hell, he's lived in 2 coastal cities. How about you? I don't know about you. I'd love to have the opportunity to live in a couple of coastal cities. You know, he went from the West Coast to the East Coast. You know, living the life he wanted to live. And maybe looking for work or doing whatever he did, but he was able to freely move about the country. Louisa Dunne never had that chance.
Granted, she was 75 years old, Joe, but she wasn't dead until she came in contact with him. But I have a question for you, because something happened in 2012 where they actually were trying to get the palm print from him. And as they're rolling the fingers or whatever, I guess that wasn't an issue. But they did have that palm print. You know, that was a big deal that they had in the Louisa Dunne case. Yeah. But when they were trying to get the palm print from Ryland Headley in 2012, he actually declined to give them the print, saying that his arthritis was so severe that he couldn't move his wrist that way, that he couldn't flex it enough to actually provide them with the exact part of the palm that they needed. Yeah. Which is how he dodged that bullet.
Yeah, and that print that was left behind, just so folks know, it starts, if you'll go to the base of your pinky, okay, kind of that last knuckle there where it conjoins the palm, and extends, that side of your hand extends all the way down to where the palm of your hand connects to your wrist, all right? And if you slice that about an inch in width, that's the partial palm print they had on this guy. That's how much of the palm. Now, you've got a lot of identifiers that are contained within there. There's a lot of specific classification identifiers. You've got a lot of minutia, which are the little bits that we look for, like you hear us talk about things like ending ridges and bifurcations and pores and all these other things that we look for that are specific identifiers in printing itself. That was there. So, but the big thing here is that they were able to go back and compare this DNA deposition all the way back from 1967 with this guy that had been compelled to enter it into the database at this point in time. And this is kind of a cautionary tale, I think, and we're going to see this. Mark my words right now. Write down the date and time, because I am telling you, we're going to see more and more of these cases. And a lot of it is going to be reliant upon what kind of job the investigators did all those years ago. And from this old investigator, I want to send out a tip of the cap to those constables back in 1967 in Bristol that didn't give up and did their job. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.